For much of the United States history, the belief that white people are inherently and innately superior to all other races drove social and political policy. But the next book in our Black Voices Book Club series makes the argument that behind that belief is a fearful obsession with interracial sex, an obsession that made integration an untenable prospect. White Fright, the sexual panic at the heart of America's racist history, re-examines the Reconstruction era through the 1960s and offers a new perspective on America's history of white supremacy. Joining us now is the book's author, Jane Daly, who is also an associate professor of history at the University of Chicago. Professor Daly, thank you so much for joining us. So your book, it reframes the roots of American racism to not only include not only the baseline belief about white superiority, but also a deep anxiety in about the fear of Black sexuality. How did this book and that foundation come about?
That foundation came out of the Civil War, more specifically the emancipation and then enfranchisement of Black men. You don't find a lot of white anxiety about interracial sex before the Civil War. In fact, you find a lot of white men having sex with Black women, usually forcing themselves on slave women. But after the Civil War, when Black men step up as citizens and as voters, then you see this new argument about Black sort of bestiality, uncontrollability, hypersexuality.
So central to your book are, the concept of miscegenation and the question of who is white and who is not. How and when did those ideas begin to form?
Well, the excuse me, laws against interracial marriage go all the way back to 1705 in Virginia, and they're not undone until 1967. So you've got a really long period of time there. And laws that try to define people's races change a lot over the years. Usually they get stricter, meaning that used to be, say, you had to be 50% supposedly white to be considered white, then you might have to be more than that. And it varied by state. You could change your race by crossing state lines. If the law changed, your race could be changed for you by the law changing. So it was very complicated, and it was always done in terms of deciding who is white versus who is not white.
Why was it important, then for segregationists, white supremacists, which I think is a term that wasn't formed until later on, but why was it important for those people to keep the races from mingling?
Well, that's a good question. It was important in order to keep whiteness as a category. You can't have white supremacy if you don't know who's white. So one of the ironies of white supremacy, of course, is that it's been undone from the very first time that Africans came to our shores and mixed with English people and others. There was no such thing as the so-called pure white race, but ideas about white supremacy and laws that are defined to make it possible, they're there in order to keep that racial hierarchy in place.
And those same segregationists, how did they make the leap that if schools are integrated, that would somehow lead to interracial marriage and therefore a bunch of multiracial, biracial children and marriages?
Right. Well, it was very easy. They said if you put little Black boys next to little white girls, they would get to know each other, and then they'd get to like each other, and then they'd go out on dates, and then they'd get engaged, and then they'd get married, and then you would have mixed race grandchildren.
Super simple. Okay. One of the legal cases that you discuss in your book, though, illustrates how slippery that idea of whiteness can be. In Rhinelander versus Rhinelander, can you give us a quick outline of that one?
Right. Yeah. One of the things I try to show in the book is that we think of these laws as just being in the South. They weren't. There wasn't one in New York State, which is where this case comes from, which makes it interesting. There was one in California. I talk about later, but in Rhinelander v. Rhinelander, we have Kip Rhinelander was the scion of a really big and rich family in New York. The Rhinelanders, they go all the way back to New Amsterdam, and he secretly married a woman he had met while he was actually in an asylum, and fell in love with her, and hung around her family a lot, and they ran away and eloped. And when his father found out, he went berserk and said, this is a Black woman. You haven't even married a white woman. Now, it was legal to marry across the color line in New York, but the Rhinelanders didn't like Alice Jones, Rhinelander. She was possibly not white. She was from a working class family. So they they wanted a divorce, and Alice actually sued. The Rhinelanders sued, charging her with fraud, saying that she had impersonated a white person when she was not actually white.